So thank you very much for having me this morning, and good morning from Calgary. It's 5 a.m. here, so I'm excited to speak at this early in the morning. But before I jump into this discussion on convergences and divergences of the Indo-Pacific, I wanted to just make a note and share my views about the passing or the unfortunate death of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And I think this is, it's tragic for Japan, it's tragic for the region for many reasons, but one of the key reasons related to today's discussion is that he was really the person that put the idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific on the table back in 2007 in India at a speech to their parliament discussing the so-called confluence of two seas. And it was his diplomacy, his vision that I think has been adopted in part, or at least localized in many countries, including the United States, Denmark, Germany, the European Union, of course, Japan, the United States. We have the South Koreans talking about building and creating their own Indo-Pacific vision. The UK, although they don't have an Indo-Pacific vision per se, they've incorporated into their integrated defense strategy. The French have one, and Australia recognizes itself as an Indo-Pacific country. And when you drill down into some of its defense strategy texts, it talks about the Indo-Pacific. So I just would like to recognize the late Prime Minister's enormous contributions to this concept. And they have been internationalized and they have been institutionalized to a certain degree in many places. And this will be his lasting legacy in terms of foreign policy in the broader region. So I wish his family and, of course, the former Prime Minister, I'd like to just send my condolences to both because I think they were such important, Prime Minister Abe was such an important actor on the foreign policy front. So let's just pivot from that initial comment about former Prime Minister Abe, and let's talk about the Indo-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific region's convergences and divergences. Now, I think what we can do is we can create a continuum of where we sit in terms of concepts or conceptualizations of the Indo-Pacific. On the one hand, I think the most watered down, or I guess the one that has the less concrete aspects of it, would be the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, and I'll come back to that. And the one that is probably the most securitarized would be the former United States president's Indo-Pacific strategy, that is the Trump Indo-Pacific strategy. And between those two bookends, we see a lot of different interpretations of what the Indo-Pacific strategy or vision or guideline should be. And I think this is an important kind of way to help us understand the direction of the evolution of the Indo-Pacific. So let's start with the Indo-Pacific, the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, and what are some of the distinguishing features of this particular document. And I think that really in looking at the history of the Indo-Pacific outlook of ASEAN, really, we should understand that it was a response to a growing number of countries creating Indo-Pacific visions, and that ASEAN was feeling that it was losing its central position within the regional integration process. And what I mean by that is that since 1997, that Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, as they were integrating their economy, they agreed that the ASEAN way, or the consensus-based decision-making process that was formed in the amongst the initial 6 members of ASEAN, and then of course when they added the rest, the 10 members of ASEAN, they agreed that the way to move forward in terms of growth and economic and political integration was that all the members needed to agree upon whatever the decision was through consensus. And they felt that ASEAN centrality needed to be respected and promoted as part of this integration process. So what we saw as a response to seeing Japan and the United States and other countries adopt Indo-Pacific strategies, that ASEAN felt that it was really important to conceptualize its ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, stressing the importance of ASEAN centrality and consensus-based decision-making, and that the way forward to connect the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean must place ASEAN centrality as the cornerstone of that integration process. The agreement itself says very little about security, except that it doesn't want a securitarized region. It stresses that consensus-based decision-making should be the way that the region moves forward in terms of integration. And it talks a little bit about how the ASEAN region really connects. It's the land bridge for the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. And this is really the characteristic feature no concrete policies, not really focused on economic integration or development or infrastructure connectivity. Rather, it really focuses on this idea of ASEAN centrality. On the other end of the spectrum, we have, I think, the Indo-Pacific strategy that emerged out of the United States under the Trump administration. Now, while this is not representative of the current Biden administration's focus, what we saw is that the Trump administration took on an Indo-Pacific strategy, mostly thanks to the guidance of the late Prime Minister Abe. And this became a very securitized document. And when we look through the Indo-Pacific strategy, both the official one, but also the one that was released, the redacted version that was released, really it was a securitized way to think about the Indo-Pacific region with China deeply in mind. It didn't think about this idea of economic integration as critical to building stability within the region. It didn't really think about trade and trade agreements like the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership as important in building a more cohesive region. And this is why we saw the Trump administration, or one of the reasons why the Trump administration left the TPP-11. The Indo-Pacific strategy out of the United States talked about democracy, human rights, and it was in many ways not an inclusive kind of agreement. And what I mean inclusive is that because it talked about democracy, because it talked about human rights, because it talked about a securitized approach with China, it excluded many partners. For a country like Vietnam, and I say we have a few Vietnamese friends online like Phong and Han and Lin, because it focused on these value-oriented and a securitized approach, it really excluded countries like Vietnam, many other countries in Southeast Asia, and other countries that have very strong economic relations with China, that literally can't choose between the two countries. Now, the initial Indo-Pacific strategy was not static. It did evolve out of the United States. It evolved to have funding for example, infrastructure, where they worked between the Japanese and the Australians and the Americans to build and fund infrastructure by giving loans to private businesses. So this is a distinguishing feature, although many would say that it was not very effective. We saw that the United States, under the former administration, also increased the number of security forms of cooperation within the region. And we saw is that, again, China was the center of the Indo-Pacific strategy, and this created challenges for many of the countries whose greatest and biggest trading partner is China. Now, today's Biden administration and how they look at the Indo-Pacific strategy seems to understand that it's not just about security. They seem to understand that standards are critically important to shaping the region's future, and this is why we see the emergence of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. We see that the Biden administration seems to understand that minilateral cooperation with the Quad, Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, and AUKUS are important ways to inculcate deterrence within the region, but also shape the next generation of technologies that will shape the region, including its governance structures. But we still see trade, in particular opening up the U.S. market, as not a critical part of the Biden administration's approach to the their Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, those are the bookends. Now, when we look into the center, I think we see countries and regions with very similar approaches to thinking about the Indo-Pacific. And now, Japan is really important here. Again, Japan, under Prime Minister Abe, brought forth and manifested the free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And this vision really focuses on promoting a rules-based order. So what that means is that rules are the primary arbiter and last arbiter of how states deal with conflict and disagreement within the region. And they wanted to bolster that and improve that by getting buy-in by as many states as possible. And there was a strong feeling that, in particular China, but also North Korea, was issuing international law to pursue either weapons of mass destruction in the case of North Korea, or in the case of China, pursuing territories that belong to Japan or Southeast Asian countries in the East China Sea and South China Sea. So Japan's conceptualization of a free and open Indo-Pacific vision really focused on a rules-based order, in particular in the maritime environment, but also in the terrestrial area, such as the Himalayan plateau. But they also focused on development, infrastructure and connectivity, institution building, and a non-normative approach or non-value approach to cooperation. And here we see Japan cooperate with Vietnam, Brunei, Singapore, India, as many countries as possible. And what's distinguishing about this is that they cooperate with socialist states, theocracies, soft authoritarian states, states that are challenged in terms of their democracy. And the view from Tokyo is basically that you can't exclude the partners that you want if you want to build a region. And rules-based process and institution building will take time in terms of cooperation, ensuring that concepts such as ASEAN centrality and consensus-based decision-making are the key pillar of how any kind of Indo-Pacific strategy moves forward. Use this concept to expand and make it inclusive as possible vision that does not necessarily exclude China, but it's meant to constrain China's behavior in the maritime domain and hopefully pull it in a different direction so that it is more rules-based in how it functions with the international community in the Indo-Pacific. But also, there's hope in the Tokyo context that the approaches and the norms and the values, or the approaches to cooperation that Tokyo is promoting through the free and open Indo-Pacific vision would be something that could internationalize or shape initiatives coming out of Beijing, such as the Belt Road Initiative. Now, whether that's going to be successful or not, it's really too early to say, but that has been the broader approach of the Japanese. And it continues to be the approach under the Kishida administration. And we saw this at the Shangri-La Dialogue, where Prime Minister Kishida talked very openly about the free and open Indo-Pacific as the basis for his Kishida vision of peace for the broader region. Now, very similar to the Japanese concept is looking at the German Indo-Pacific guidelines. They don't explicitly mention China, but they do talk about challenges to a rules-based order within the region and how this could affect trade, it could affect institution building, and it could affect how this most critical part of the world's global economy moves forward. And the Germans, when they formulated their strategy back in 2000, were really thinking about how they could continue to enjoy the economic benefits of their relationship with China, while at the same time, like the Japanese, constrain Chinese behavior through cooperation and through participating in many kinds of multilateral, multi-layered agreements, such as the Japan-EU economic partnership, but also increasing German presence within the region diplomatically and in terms of security. The Germans today have changed the tune quite a bit with regards to how they're thinking about the Indo-Pacific region. And this change has come primarily through the influence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They now seem to understand that the challenge of Russia to Ukraine in terms of a rules-based order could actually occur in the Indo-Pacific region with a country like China, and this could fundamentally destabilize German economic interests within the region. And as a result, they are investing more of their diplomatic and economic resources in the region. Not so much on the security side, but focusing on similar pillars to the Japanese in a way to try to constrain the Chinese assertive behavior within the region. And this is done by helping stakeholders within the region build up their own capacities so that they can have more strategic autonomy. Other visions, such as the Denmark vision, really resonate very closely with the Germans. The French vision for the Indo-Pacific really is based on their actual geographic presence within the region. So the French actually have territories within the Indo-Pacific region, in particular the Pacific Islands, and they feel that they have a stake in ensuring that this region remains rules-based and not dominated by one superpower or the other. The EU has also adopted an Indo-Pacific vision, and that vision is broad, very similar to the German vision. It outlines the importance of rules. It outlines the importance of building institutions. It outlines the importance of ensuring that non-traditional security issues such as climate change, piracy, illegal fishing do not destabilize this critical and important area of economic intercourse that will really be the center of global trade in the years to come. The EU Indo-Pacific strategy does not explicitly criticize China, but it does explicitly make references to concerns about destabilizing behavior. Again, this is an important way to be thinking about how the Europeans themselves want to maintain that strong relationship with China. They understand the economic benefits associated with China. They understand that they are geographically distant from China, and as a result don't face the same pressures as countries directly in its backyard, but they do recognize at the same time that some of the behavior that they've been seeing is highly destabilizing and it could affect European interests. Now, the European the European Union's Indo-Pacific strategy, of course, requires consensus from all its members. And this is very, very interesting, the internal dynamics. When I was in Europe in May and June, I heard a lot about this, is that while there are some countries like Hungary and others that have a closer relationship with China and a more interest-based approach to their foreign policy, is that they were willing to accept the European Union's strategy because it was allowed them to have to support their position within the European Union and the broader European Union's Indo-Pacific strategy, while at the same time they could have their national approach to dealing with China, where they could basically retain those strong relationships with China and refrain from criticizing it directly as part of its own diplomacy within the region. So again, let's just review. We have a continuum of views about what the Indo-Pacific vision is. I guess the softest or the least institutionalized one is the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook. And this is not a criticism, it's just a characterization. And the most securitarized version was probably the one out of the Trump administration, which has become slightly less securitarized under the Biden administration, with recognition of the importance of trade, standard setting, alliances, and balancing deterrence, resilience, and engagement. And within the middle, I think the Japanese, the Germans have a lot of overlap in their views about the Indo-Pacific strategy, but Japan being geographically within the region, they have a more proactive approach. And of course, tremendous resources and historical footprint within the region. And then the Danish and the European Union, and the French have their own views that really resonate with much of what we see coming out of Germany and the EU in general. So I'll stop there. That's the kind of convergences and divergences I see, and I'd love to hear views from others in the room.